Hello there, and welcome to my home city, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For those of you visiting the place for the first time, welcome. Whether you're attracted here by the ring of the Liberty Bell or the smell of cheesesteaks, or made morbidly curious by our insane sports fans and a crazy TV show that happened to be set here, there's a lot more to the city than just the stereotypes. You can find a lot of historic, even picturesque streets and buildings, great restaurants, museums, and markets, a surprisingly robust higher education scene, and perhaps most surprising to some, particularly those who only know of going places by car in the States and nothing else, Philly has a rather unique system of public transportation, one with good strengths and amazing future potential, but also one with issues that everyone around here has had to get accustomed to. In this video series, I'll be giving you an overview of the different modes of transportation in Philadelphia, from its sprawling regional rail system, its unique metro system with some of the quirkiest lines in North America, to put it one way, down to its humble buses and trolleys, both with and without tracks. Each of these are deserving of their own videos, but I want to start with the system that is probably one of the most well-known to outsiders, and if you're arriving into Philly from the airport, it will likely be one of the first modes of public transport you come across: the regional rail network. Before we start in earnest, though, I believe a brief overview of Philly's public transit services is in order. The overwhelming majority of the city and suburbs public transit services are run by the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, or SEPTA for short. SEPTA is in charge of the regional rail network, except for one line, the subway lines, also except for one line, as well as the buses and trolleys, both in the city itself and in the suburbs that surround it on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, which separates Philly and the state of Pennsylvania from the magical land of pork rolls, freeway overpasses, and urban hell sprawl that is New Jersey. Aside from SEPTA, you will hear several other names as we go through this, including but not limited to Amtrak, the U.S.'s national passenger rail operator for intercity services, New Jersey Transit, of which you have 5 guesses to figure out where they mostly serve, and they mostly run bus services as well as a light rail and a regional rail line, along with PATCO, the Port Authority Transit Corporation, which operates a single metro line also serving New Jersey. But those are worth their own discussions when we get to them. For now, though, let's dive into the main topic of this first video, the SEPTA Regional Rail Network. SEPTA's regional rail network consists of 13 rail lines serving 155 stations on 280 route miles of track, and can be a quick and efficient way to visit the city's CBD, better known as Center City around here, and its outer neighborhoods and suburbs, with 3 of the lines going into 2 neighboring states of New Jersey and Delaware. The main thing that binds all of these routes together, quite literally into a cohesive network, runs underneath Center City itself, and is known as the Center City Commuter Connection, or the Commuter Tunnel. The tunnel was built between 1978 and 1984 as a way to directly link the 2 initially disconnected networks that SEPTA operated before then. Now, the main reason why these 2 systems were disconnected stems from the fact that both parts of the network were originally built and operated by 2 rival private railroad companies, with the 7 lines on the network that run westbound out of the Center City Tunnel, the Trenton, Wilmington Newark, Paoli Thorndale, Media Wawa, Kinwood, Chestnut Hill West, and Airport, lines, being originally run by the Pennsylvania Railroad, often called the Pennsy for short. And the 6 lines that run north and eastbound out of the tunnel, the Manayunk-Norristown, Fox Chase, West Trenton, Warminster, Lansdale-Doylestown, and Chestnut Hill East lines, being originally run by the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, or the Reading Company for short. Both of these networks would run out of 2 separate terminals in Center City before the tunnel was built, with Suburban Station being the original terminus for the Pennsy lines, being the last remains of the beautiful Broad Street station, which was sadly demolished in the 50s to make way for the Liberty Place towers and this office building with a vestigial train station underneath it. Yes, New Yorkers, we have one of those stories too. We feel your pain. Meanwhile, the Reading lines originally ran out of Reading Terminal, which closed when the tunnel opened in 1984 and is now part of the Pennsylvania Convention Center, with the massive single-span roof from the old train shed still surviving. Most crucially of all though, the station's marketplace survived as well, and it's easily one of my favorite places in the entire city. Definitely check it out when you're here, you won't be disappointed. To replace the old Reading Terminal, a new station was built in the Center City Tunnel, right underneath it in fact. Originally known as Market East after the newly established retail district that it serves, the station is officially known as Jefferson Station today, due to a sponsorship deal with Thomas Jefferson University and their nearby hospital. This tunnel and its stations allow for SEPTA trains to do something rather unique in North American commuter rail services, that one train can serve two lines in a single trip. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you ever look at a station in the suburbs, let's say here on the Media Wawa line on the Pennsy side of the network for instance, you'll notice that in most cases, the train's end terminal station is often not a station in Center City. In this case, the trains are mostly ending in Norristown, which is on the Reading side of the network. What happens here is that the train completes its run from Wawa to Center City, runs through the tunnel, often with a quick crew change at Suburban Station, before continuing through the city and back up to Norristown, and all without the passengers needing to change if they're heading up that way anyway. In fact, just to add to this, there was originally a system that we had when the tunnel opened that trains on certain lines always ran to certain lines once they passed through the tunnel. The Wilmington-Newark line went up the Warminster line and vice versa. The Paoli-Thorndale line was paired with the Lansdale-Doylestown line. The Media-Wawa line was paired with the West Trenton line, and so on. And each of these routes were given an R number designation, such as R1, R2, R3, and so on, in a system that was directly inspired by German S-Bahn systems. Sadly, SEPTA never really got around to making the service improvements necessary for it to truly be an S-Bahn, due to SEPTA's rather annoying tendency for stepping on rakes being at its peak in the 1980s when the system was first introduced, which if you want to know more, check out this podcast here. And even though the infrastructure does exist for that to happen if SEPTA gets the funding to do so, the R number system was dropped in 2010, ostensibly to improve line flexibility. While perhaps more flexible from an operator standpoint, it does make things confusing for passengers at times, since which route they go on after they pass through the city can vary from day to day or even train to train. And the legacy of that old system still survives today, with not only old signage surviving to this day in places if you know where to look, and in veteran riders who still refer to their lines under the old designations. Anyway, on to the frequency of service. As American regional rail systems go, it's not the worst out there, but it's not exactly a world beater either. In the morning and afternoon rush hours, most SEPTA lines operate with 15-minute frequencies, so 4 trains per hour, which does make it useful for the 9-to-5 office worker in a lot of cases. Beyond the rush hour, after 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then after 7 p.m., the frequency dips to hourly on most lines, and in some cases in the middle of the day, once every 2 hours for some inexplicable reason. I'm looking at you, Wilmington-Newark line. You of all routes? Seriously? But easily the strangest of all is the single SEPTA route that not only never runs hourly, it only runs 6 round trips a day on the shortest route on the network. That is the tiny 6.1 mile long Kinwood line, whose trains incredibly only consist of a single car most of the time. But it's also the only regional rail line that doesn't through run through the tunnel at all, instead ending its journey to the city at its own dedicated platform at Suburban Station. I'll definitely be making a video about this line in the future, so keep an eye out for that, since its history and potential is quite fascinating. All told though, it certainly beats out the traditional American commuter rail service that would mostly only serve lines at rush hour and maybe a token run in the afternoon if you're lucky. But it's not quite to the caliber of, say, Metro North, Long Island Railroad, and New Jersey Transit around New York City, where you have consistent trains multiple times an hour throughout the day. The potential definitely exists for it to get to that level though with the infrastructure that they have, with the main problem being a lack of state investment, a lack of a dedicated funding mechanism for the agency, a lack of crews to run to that frequency, and to a much lesser extent older equipment to make that happen. As for when services actually run, service generally can start around 4:30 a.m. and go all the way to 1 a.m., though the last trains would actually start their final runs in the 12 o'clock hour. So the operation is not 24/7, but it can serve a lot of trips for sure, though this is not universal. And some routes like the aforementioned Wilmington-Newark line only start running in the 5 a.m. hour and have their last runs in the 10 o'clock hour. So do take care of your time on those routes. I know I've made that mistake before. And that's to say nothing of the aforementioned Kinwood line, whose last run is at 6 p.m. out of Center City, right at the tail end of the rush hour, and has no services at all on weekends, unlike literally every other route in the system. Oh, and speaking of weekends, most SEPTA services on weekends run every hour now after a big increase in services recently, but there are still routes that run services every 2 hours, and I have my own stories about how that can suck in its own right. The good news is that SEPTA does run 24/7 bus services on certain routes, so there are alternatives in some situations, and other agencies tend to serve areas that are either at or close to a lot of regional rail stations. And while this is definitely not the case on all routes, there are possible alternatives if you party just a bit too hard and need to find an alternative to the regional rail and don't want to be robbed blind by calling an Uber. When it comes to fares, it still maintains that could be better, could be worse thought process. And it's here where we are introduced to the Key Card, SEPTA's contactless payment card for their transit services. Introduced in 2016, the Key Card had, shall I say, not the smoothest of introductions, particularly when the consultants that SEPTA brought on board apparently had no experience with transit payment systems, and the total cost of the agency to implement it was nearly $200 million, about $70 million more than originally planned. Yet another one of those examples of SEPTA stepping on rakes, I see. Once all of its problems were, mostly, alleviated, the Key Card would see common use among the system's regular riders, with one of the bigger incentives being cheaper fares, though I must make clear that this is subject to change due to possible changes to fares to compensate for a budget shortfall that SEPTA is currently facing as of now. You better believe I'll be talking about this in the future. The standard transit fare in Philadelphia, which is the fare on everything except regional rail, is $2.50 in cash, while paying with a Key Card, or as of lately a regular contactless credit card, is $2 for a single trip. Regional rail, though, is a very different beast, since the regional rail system uses a zone-based fare system. Now, for those who don't know, a zone-based fare system splits each line into zones based on how close or far away they are from the Center City fare zone in the middle of the network. This is actually a rather common arrangement on commuter and regional rail systems across North America. And as commuter rail fares go, SEPTA is far from the worst cost-wise, even if one thing you have to do in order for it to work properly is to both tap the Key Card at your origin station and at your destination station for it to register, unlike on the buses, trolleys, or subways where you just tap once when you go in and you're good. For the prices, a single zone fare, let's say between Germantown and one of the 5 Center City zone stations, Temple University, Jefferson, Suburban, 30th Street, or Penn Medicine, would be $3.75 on the Key Card, $5.75 with a quick trip ticket at a ticket machine, which for the most part you can only get in the Center City stations for some obtuse reason, something which I go on a bit of a rant on in another video of mine, and paying for the ticket on board the train with the conductor in cash is $6. The longest zone distance in most cases is Zone 4, let's say between Center City and Doylestown, and that would be $6.50 on the Key Card, $6.75 with a quick trip ticket, and $8 in cash. Now, there are a fair few lines that don't even go as far out to Zone 4 fares, with the Media-Wawa, Manioc-Norristown, and Warminster lines only going as far as Zone 3, and the Kinwood, Fox Chase, and both of the Chestnut Hill lines only going as far as Zone 2, which is rather fitting since 3 of those 4 lines never leave the city proper, and in the case of the Fox Chase line, it only barely leaves Philadelphia proper. And thus, they mostly serve the close suburban neighborhoods of the city. Though on the flip side of all of that is the airport line, which after leaving Penn Medicine Station in the Center City zone, makes a Zone 1 stop at its only intermediate station in Eastwick, and then immediately jumps to Zone 4 for the airport terminals, which for reference is only 2 miles and a 4-minute trip time away. Yes, really. Alongside that though, there's another interesting thing to mention too, and that's the little discussed 5th fare zone. On 2 of the lines, the Trenton Line and West Trenton Line, the namesake end terminal stations are the only 2 stations on the network listed in that 5th zone, which is not even given a number and are simply called the NJ zones, as both those stations, if that name didn't give it away, are in New Jersey. Why that is, I'm frankly not sure, and I haven't really been able to find too much meaningful insight in my research, so if anyone can enlighten us, let me know in the comments. In any case, a trip between either of the 2 Jersey stops and Center City would come down to $8.25 on the key card, $9.25 with a quick trip ticket, and a flat $10 in cash. A bit more expensive than the rest, but it's still better than a fair number of other commuter rail operators I've seen. Metro North! Now before I move on, there's one other thing with fares that I'd be remiss to mention, and that's what's known as an extended trip, which is where one goes from a station on one line of the network to another line on the network, whether it be going through the Center City Tunnel or just going back out the other direction. For example, a trip going from, let's say, Crumlin on the Wilmington-Newark line, going through the tunnel, regardless if you stay on the same train or transfer to a different train, and continue through the other side of Center City to, let's say, Langhorne on the West Trenton line, that trip would be $6.50 on the key and $9.25 with either a quick trip ticket or cash, though the quick trip ticket would only be had at stations like Trenton or Wilmington and very few other places. Now, obviously the way you make this work when you're transferring is by not going through the turnstiles of the Center City stations, sit on the platform or the waiting area, and wait for your train, so that it thinks your trip is continuing like you didn't transfer at all. And of course, unless we're in the peak time, this transfer can either be really easy or really annoying, so hopefully you can stay on the train for the place beyond the city you want to go to. And all this is before the passes that SEPTA has to offer, but that's honestly for another time because that would make this video last even longer than it already is. Anyway, on to the kinds of trains that you'll find around here. And one of the things that makes SEPTA very unique and even future-proofed as regional rail operators go is the fact that the entire SEPTA network is run with electric trains. Wouldn't Ben Franklin be proud of that? Both the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad set up the electrification on their lines around Philadelphia beginning in 1915, starting with the Pennsylvania electrifying their famous Main Line, the namesake of the bougie main line of suburbs, which is now the Paoli-Thorndale Line, or officially the Keystone Corridor by Amtrak, because Amtrak actually owns that line. Electrification really began to pick up on both railroads in the 1920s and 30s, with pretty much all of the main passenger lines out of the city having the electric wires reach the outer and inner suburbs. Or, in the case of the Pennsylvania, because for a time they were run by forward-thinking megaminds apparently, they electrified the entirety of their main line from New York City through Philly to Wilmington, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., creating the southern half of the Northeast Corridor that we know today, the best rail line in the entire country right now. They also electrified the main line all the way out to Harrisburg and wanted to go as far as Pittsburgh with an eye of possibly going to Chicago in the future, but that never happened because of an annoying thing called World War II and a few other things. Today, after the diesel-powered quasi-intercity services that SEPTA ran, which yes, I will make a video on, and a really weird and controversial diesel shuttle at the end of the Fox Chase line to Newtown was discontinued in the early 80s, though not before presenting the absolute worst thing to ever run on SEPTA rails and maybe all of American rails ever. SEPTA has been an all-electric service ever since, and today is one of only 3 commuter and regional rail operators to be all electric powered in the US, with the only other ones as of the making of this video being the RTD in Denver, and the third one is not Caltrain because they still have that diesel shuttle to Gilroy. It's the South Shore line running between South Bend, Indiana and Chicago, which, no, is not a part of Metra. It's run by a separate agency from the state of Indiana. As for the trains themselves, the vast majority of their trains are run not with a traditional locomotive and coaches, but rather with what are called EMUs, or electric multiple units. These are essentially powered coaches that have the motors and the pantographs, that being the big arm thingy on the top of the trains which are used to collect electricity from the wires, being built into the bodies of the cars. EMUs have been used in the Philly area pretty much from the outset of electrification around here, and they're really the empirically best way to run a passenger train, since they're lighter than a standard locomotive and coach set, but still very powerful, have quick acceleration and braking, and can carry similar if not more passengers. As of now, SEPTA has 2 types of EMU cars, both of which are part of a family known as Silverliners, owing to their silver stainless steel design. The older and by far more common of these cars are the Silverliner 4s, built by General Electric and Avco at General Electric's Erie, Pennsylvania shops, with the car bodies made by the famous Budd Company hailing from North Philadelphia. These cars date back to the mid-1970s, and yes, that means we have trains running around here that are 50 years old now. Despite their age, they've been reliable for the longest time and easy to maintain. But given that SEPTA is now starting to actively seek a replacement, a topic of which I have a video on right here, it's becoming clear that their age is starting to catch up to them. Regardless though, from a passenger standpoint, they're often seen as, at the very least, serviceable for most, albeit there are a lack of certain amenities like charging plugs at seats, information screens, and the like. They have a typical 3+2 seating arrangement with bench seats, and while the seats aren't my favorites, they definitely do the job for the less than hour-long journeys that most SEPTA riders take. Alongside the old Silverliner 4s, there are the Silverliner 5s. Built by Hyundai Rotem in the late 2000s and entering service in 2010, 5 years late, it's complicated, the 5s, aside from their flashier look externally, have more modern systems, both for operators and passengers. From passenger information screens to newer seats in both a 3+2 and 2+2 layout, and as anyone who watched my video on the 4s will tell you, my favorite feature of these trains being a forward-facing window that the passengers can see out of, a feature unique to the 5s around here, though the lack of plugs or charging ports seems rather weird for trains that arrived in the early 2010s, I must admit. Both the 4s and the 5s find themselves running on pretty much the entire remit of the SEPTA network, from off-peak to rush hour, local to express services, and are rather adaptable in that sense. As a brief explainer here, since I intend to be more detailed in the future, services tend to have 3 pattern types: local, limited, and express, with the latter 2 only appearing on certain lines. For instance, the Media Wawa, Paoli Thorndale, and Trenton lines run express services in rush hours, which is where the train stops at stations further out from the cities and skips every stop closer to the city before reaching the center city stops. Whereas the likes of the Wilmington Newark, Manayunk Norristown, and Warminster lines run limited services in rush hours, where the trains skip a few stations, but generally certain lower use stations in between the more well-used ones. Regardless, the 4s and the 5s can be found on pretty much any of these lines and service patterns. But there is a special train type that only appears at certain times of the day on certain services, and those are the only locomotive-hauled trains that SEPTA runs. Nicknamed the Bomber trains by Cruise, named after the maker of the coaches of the train, which are Comet Series cars built by Bombardier in the 1990s. Bombardier, Bomber, get it? These trains are hauled by a small fleet of 15 Siemens ACS-64 electric locomotives, which, if they look familiar, this is because they're the exact same ACS-64s used by Amtrak to haul intercity services on the Northeast Corridor, powering pretty much everything Amtrak runs on the NEC that's not the Acela Express. And in turn, the ACS-64s are based on the Siemens Eurosprinter and Siemens Vectron electric locomotives that are common on passenger train services in Europe. SEPTA only tends to run the bomber trains in rush hours in the peak direction, and they only run them as expresses or limiteds, which depending on the line can save a fair amount of time on your trip or could be a minor boost to speed. But I will say, despite their more sluggish acceleration compared to the EMUs, I think it's a shame that they aren't run as often, or even that express services aren't as common as I'd like them to be. And that's probably because the bombers have what are, by far and away, my favorite seats on any SEPTA vehicle, and one of my favorites on commuter trains in the US, period. The Comet coaches were refitted in the mid-2010s, and the seats that they have are very comfortable. I wouldn't say they're Amtrak good, since that's insanely hard to top, but when you have seats that can put you to sleep pretty quickly and comfortably, even if you didn't think you were tired, you know you have a winner for sure. And that's what these seats have done to me. How I've never missed my stop riding these, I don't know. The main weird thing I'm sure you noticed about the seats is that there's no headrest in the aisle seat in the 3-seat side of each car. Why that is the case, I really don't know, so that may be a seat you'd only take if you have no other option, which considering I've seen these trains having standing room only, yeah, you may be forced into it at some point. So if you happen to be traveling in the rush hour direction, whether intentionally or not, keep an eye out for one of these sets traveling on your line, since you might find yourself on a surprisingly comfortable ride on these things. They tend to be run on the Trenton, Paoli-Thorndale, Media-Wawa, Wilmington-Newark, as well as an on-again, off-again relationship with the West Trenton line. So definitely keep your eye out for them, especially if your day was long and you really want to get comfortable for your trip home. Now we've gone to the SEPTA stuff, let's talk about the other operators out there, and two of them are really worth mentioning in this regard. Firstly, there's Amtrak, which operates intercity services out of Philly from 30th Street Station, including the highly popular Northeast Regional and the high-speed Acela services to Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston, along with the Keystone service to Harrisburg, the Pennsylvanian service to Pittsburgh, and several long-distance trains to Miami, New Orleans, Chicago, and St. Albans, Vermont, though that last one may go to Montreal in the future, fingers crossed. 30th Street Station is in fact the third busiest station on Amtrak's entire national network, only beaten by Washington, D.C. Union Station and New York Penn Station, as not only does it serve a major city, but is also a major hub for many different services, both intercity and long distance. However, if I'm being honest, it's difficult to call them regional with regard to Philadelphia. So aside from the fact that the Amtrak Keystone service serves as essentially a super express to augment the Paoli-Thorndale line up to Downingtown and soon Coatesville on its way to Harrisburg, and the Northeast Regional and the Acela could be used to speed run the Wilmington, Newark, and Trenton lines in less than half the time it takes on SEPTA, since they run at higher speeds and don't stop at any intermediate stations. The fact that Amtrak runs a separate ticketing system which is incompatible with SEPTA, and the fact that they are mainly intercity services first and foremost, I'll reserve my discussion of these services for my video series on the Northeast Corridor. However, there is one I do want to discuss a bit more, and that's the only regional rail line serving Philadelphia that's not run by SEPTA. This is the Atlantic City line, run by New Jersey Transit, which, as the name suggests, runs between 30th Street Station along the Northeast Corridor, tracing the NEC and the SEPTA Trenton line up until Frankfort Junction in Kensington. Then, the line goes over the Delaware River on the Delaware Bridge, serving Pennsauken on the far bank north of Camden, then winding through Cherry Hill to follow the Patco Speed line from Haddonfield to Lindenwold before continuing across the South Jersey Pine Barrens, making a few intermediate stops before arriving in the gambling capital of the East Coast, Atlantic City, New Jersey. In many ways, the Atlantic City line is the lone survivor of a time gone by, since the Atlantic City line is the last route remaining of what once was the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, or PRSL, a rail network that once sprawled out into South Jersey from its hub in Camden to places like Glassboro, Vineland, Swedesboro, Medford, Millville, and even all the way down the shore to Ocean City, Wildwood, and Cape May. There's now something of a push to bring a few of these lines back, and that's a topic I want to dive into in the future. but for now, the Atlantic City line is the only one left as of 2024. Unlike SEPTA's network, the Atlantic City line runs solely on diesel power, and it's always been sort of the red-headed stepchild of NJ Transit's commuter rail services, as it's not connected to the rest of the NJT commuter network, with the exception of connecting to the River Line, which I'll talk about more in my third video in this series. Aside from being not connected as efficiently to the rest of the NJT network, its route through North Philadelphia before it crosses the river and winds its way down towards Lindenwold before finally going on a straight shot, quite literally, to AC, does tend to add to the trip time, taking about an hour and a half to cover the entire trip, which could definitely be better than sitting in traffic on the Atlantic City Expressway time-wise, and much more comfortable. But many may argue it can be better, proposing several different options for this thing, and I will come to that in the future. This is not entirely helped by the fact that the line is mostly single-tracked with passing sidings, which on a line that was once double-tracked is rather annoying and gimps the frequency down to 10 round trips a day on weekdays, with trains once every hour and a half, because what even is clock-face scheduling? That said, the train does provide a viable car-free alternative to Atlantic City or Philly, and the service even comes with a shuttle bus service from the Atlantic City terminal to the local hotels and casinos. The trains themselves are mostly made up of NJT's expansive fleet of Bombardier Comet coaches, making them similar to the passenger to SEPTA's bombers, with the exception of the older seats, which, while to me are not quite as comfortable as SEPTA cars, at least in the ones that are not the cab cars, and since I'd argue those are just as good, they definitely have their charm to them. They kind of feel like sitting on a well-loved family couch. Plus, they're flippy seats. Instant win there. Motive power on the line has mostly consisted lately of NJT's 1960s and 70s vintage GP40PH-2B diesels, making for some of the oldest rolling stock allocations not just on the NJT system, but any passenger rail system in the US. Regardless, I think the Atlantic City line deserves more recognition, both from rail fans and residents alike, as I can imagine a trip to the shore or the casino being a lot less of a hassle with the train than being stuck in South Jersey's infamous traffic jams. And if you want to see for yourself if it's worth it, the cost of a one-way fare is $12.35 between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. So while it's more expensive than your typical SEPTA fare, for a route that many would argue is more of an intercity line than a commuter line, it's certainly far from the worst I can imagine. Give it a ride and see for yourself. So that's my brief summary of Philadelphia's regional rail network. In my humble opinion, SEPTA has the makings of one of, if not the best regional rail network on the entire continent, with the infrastructure and equipment that it has on hand. But for all of its incredible potential, it's definitely frustrating that we've had the means and the pre-existing potential for true transport greatness, and we've just been sitting on it. That being said, what we still have is a cut above a lot of other cities in the US at the very least, since it can actually be practical for a lot more trips than just the run to and from work in the city. Whether you're going on a day trip to Center City, sampling a restaurant in Media, Conshohocken, or Doylestown, going for a hike in Fox Chase, Kinwood, or Manayunk, or making your run to or from the airport, you have a lot more at your disposal than just taking a car. And that's something that will continue to be a theme as I discuss Philly's metro rail system next time, and the buses and trolleys after that. But regional rail here in Philly definitely holds a special place in my heart, since not only is it one of the things I have fond memories of as a kid, it's still of significant importance for me, providing a true alternative to driving. And while it can be better, and by every right it should be better, it's good to see that a fair amount of people can see its potential. And as the future progresses, regional rail has every possibility of becoming greater and becoming even more important than it is today in the great saga of how we get around Philly.